The sky was clear and quiet over a small patch of farmland in Kansas. The sun had just started to rise, painting the fields with soft gold light. Birds chirped in the trees, and a breeze moved gently through the tall grass. Nothing about this morning seemed different from any other, but something strange was about to happen. Above the clouds, far beyond what anyone on the ground could see, a small ship drifted silently through space. It was sleek and silver, shaped like a teardrop, and unlike anything ever built by human hands. Inside, lights blinked softly on control panels made of smooth black glass. The air smelled clean and cold, like fresh snow. A voice came through the speakers, calm but serious. Approaching target zone. In the main cabin, Lieutenant Kayla Virek sat still, her eyes fixed on the screen in front of her. She was tall, with pale blue skin and dark eyes that never seemed to blink. Her uniform was tight and gray, with lines of glowing green light running along the arms and chest. She looked ready for war. Her fingers tapped lightly on the armrest as she watched the planet grow larger on the screen. Earth, third planet from the sun, home of humans. She had read reports, seen footage, studied their weapons, their cities, their wars. Humans were dangerous. They fought each other often. They built machines to kill from far away. They did not trust outsiders. When they saw something new, something unknown, they either ran or attacked. Keela knew what to expect. Fear, violence, chaos. But she also knew how to handle it. She was trained for first contact. She had done this before on 3 other worlds. Every time. The same pattern. Confusion, panic, then surrender or death. Not here. This time, things would be different. The ship began to descend. It cut through the clouds like a stone through water. Wind rushed past its hull. Below, the land stretched wide and open. Fields rolled into the distance. A few buildings dotted the horizon. Smoke rose from one chimney. Life moved slowly down there. Keela brought the ship in low, scanning for movement. Sensors picked up a single human nearby, alone, outside, walking toward the edge of a field. She zoomed in on the image. He was older, maybe in his 50s, wore a hat, old jeans, and a flannel shirt. He held a cup of coffee in one hand and stared up at the sky with tired eyes. He didn't run. He didn't scream. He just stood there, watching, waiting. Keela frowned. She landed the ship in a soft, silent motion. The grass bent under the force of the landing thrusters, but the man didn't move. He just sipped his coffee and squinted at the strange shape now sitting in his field. The side of the ship opened with a soft hiss. Keela stepped out. The air was warm and smelled like dirt and plants. She looked around. The man was still there, standing 10 feet away, watching her like she was just another guest who showed up late. She took a step forward. He raised a hand. "Mornin'," he said. His voice was deep and rough, like gravel under boots. Keela didn't answer. She wasn't sure what to say. The man looked her up and down, then nodded. "You lost?" he asked. Keela blinked. "No," she said, her voice sharp and alien. He shrugged. "Well, you're on my land, so either you're looking for something or you need help getting back where you came from." Keela stared at him. This wasn't right. He should be scared. He should be running. He should be calling others. Instead, he offered her a bottle of water from his coat pocket. "You thirsty?" he asked. Keela didn't take it. She couldn't stop staring. "You do not know who I am," she said. "Can't say I do," the man said, putting the bottle back. "Name's Daniel. Dan for short." Keela didn't respond. Dan looked at the ship again. He walked around it slowly, like he was checking for damage. "That thing work okay?" he asked. Keela finally found her voice. "Yes." Dan nodded. "Good. Sometimes these new gadgets act up. Had a tractor once that wouldn't start unless I kicked it twice." He chuckled. Keela didn't laugh. Dan turned to her. "So, you here for something specific or just passing through?" Keila hesitated. This was not part of the plan. First contact was supposed to be tense, controlled, dangerous. But Dan didn't seem afraid. He didn't even seem surprised. Kayla tried again. "I am not from here." Dan raised an eyebrow. "Yeah? Where you from?" She paused. Then slowly she said, "Far away." Dan nodded like that made sense. "Well," he said, "if you're stuck, I've got tools in the barn. Can give you a hand if you need it." Keela looked at him like he was speaking a language she didn't understand. He was offering help to an alien, like it was normal. Keela felt something twist in her chest. Not fear, not anger, confusion, and something else. Something deeper. She had expected violence. She had come prepared for war. But this was worse, because it made no sense. Dan turned and started walking toward his house. "Come on," he said. "You might as well have some breakfast while you're here." Keela didn't move. She stood in the field looking at the man who had just invited her to eat with him, as if she were one of his own, as if she belonged. Behind her, the ship hummed quietly. Ahead, the sun climbed higher. And for the first time in her life, Keela felt something she had never felt before. Doubt, she whispered to herself. Why didn't he run? Keela stood in the field for a long time after Dan disappeared into his house. The wind moved through the grass, rustling the leaves on nearby trees. The sun was warm now, higher in the sky. Birds called to each other like nothing strange had just happened. But something very strange had happened. A human had met an alien and he had offered her coffee. Keela looked at the door of the ship behind her. It was still open. She could go back inside, close it, lift off, and leave this place forever. She could tell her superiors that first contact was odd, unpredictable, but not hostile, not dangerous. Just different. She turned toward the house again. It was small, made of wood and stone, with a red roof and a porch that sagged slightly on one side. Smoke still rose from the chimney. Dan had gone inside without fear. So she walked, her boots pressed into the soft ground as she moved across the field. Every step felt heavier than the last. Her mind kept going over what had happened. Why hadn't he run? Why hadn't he tried to hide or call others? Was he stupid? Or was she missing something? She reached the porch and stopped. The wooden floor creaked under her weight. Dan's voice came from inside. "Come on in," he said. "Door's open." Keela stepped forward slowly. The screen door swung open with a light push. Inside, the air smelled like toast and coffee. The room was small but clean. A couch sat against one wall, covered in a thick blanket. A TV played quietly in the corner, showing old cartoons. Dan was in the kitchen, moving pots and pans around. He didn't look up. "You want eggs?" he asked. Keela didn't answer. He glanced at her. "You can sit down, you know." She did, slowly, pulling out a chair at the kitchen table. It groaned under her weight. Dan cracked eggs one by one into a pan. Oil sizzled. After a moment, he spoke. "You're not from around here, huh?" Keela looked at him. "No." Dan nodded. "Figured as much. Your ride doesn't look like anything I've seen before." He flipped the eggs with a metal spatula. They landed with a soft hiss. Keela watched him carefully. "Why are you doing this?" "Doing what?" Dan asked. "Feeding me," she said. "Talking to me like we are the same." Dan paused. He wiped his hands on a towel and leaned against the counter. "Well," he said, "you're here, aren't you? Don't seem like you mean harm, so why not be polite?" Keela frowned. "You do not know me." Dan shrugged. "Don't need to. If someone shows up on my land, hungry or lost, I help. That's just how it goes." Keela didn't speak for a long time. Dan served the eggs onto 2 plates and sat across from her. He ate slowly, chewing with his mouth closed. Keela picked at hers with a fork. Finally, she looked up. "Aren't you afraid of me?" Dan blinked. Then he laughed. It was a deep, rough sound like gravel shaking in a tin can. "Afraid?" he said. "Of you?" Keela nodded. Dan put his fork down. He looked at her for a long time. "You know," he said. I've seen some scary things in my life. Storms that tore roofs off houses, snakes longer than this table, men with guns who didn't care who they hurt. He leaned forward slightly. But you? He said. You come down in a quiet ship. Talk normal, don't point any weapons, don't yell, don't try to take anything. He smiled a little. So no, he said. I ain't scared of you. Kayla stared at him. Then softly, she asked, why would you help someone you don't? No? Dan took another bite, chewed, swallowed. Because sometimes people need help, he said. And sometimes you can give it. Doesn't cost much. Kayla looked at the plate in front of her. Doesn't cost much. It was a strange way to think. In the Zalari Empire, helping strangers was rare. Survival meant strength. Weakness was punished. Kindness was a mistake. Yet here was a man offering food to someone who didn't belong, someone who could have been dangerous, someone who should have been terrifying. Keela thought again. Why didn't he run? Later, after breakfast, Dan showed her around the farm. He pointed out the barn, the chicken coop, the garden where he grew tomatoes and peppers. He talked about the weather, the harvest, and how his tractor broke down last week. Keela listened. They passed a dog lying in the shade. It lifted its head, sniffed Keela once, then went back to sleep. Dan chuckled. Buddy doesn't like strangers, he said. But he seems okay with you. Keela looked at the dog. You trust animals more than people? Dan shook his head. Trust has nothing to do with it. Buddy doesn't know better. He just does what feels right. Kayla thought about that. What feels right? Again, it made no sense. Logic said she should have been met with fear or violence. Reports said humans were aggressive, untrustworthy, but Dan was calm, kind, curious, not afraid. She followed him back to the house. He sat on the porch steps drinking another cup of coffee. Keela stood beside him. Do you know what I am? She asked. Dan looked up. Sure, you're someone who landed in my field. She shook her head. I'm not from this world. Dan sipped his coffee. Yeah. Figured that part out. Keela narrowed her eyes. You understand what that means? Dan looked at her for a long time. It means you came from somewhere else, he said. Somewhere far away. Maybe even another star system. Keela was surprised. She didn't expect him to say that. Dan smiled. Don't act so shocked. I read books, watch documentaries. Space is big, full of stuff we don't know yet. He looked out over the fields. I always figured we weren't alone, he said. Just didn't think I'd meet someone like you on a Tuesday morning. Keela sat down next to him. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It was calm. You are not like I expected, she said. Dan raised an eyebrow. How did you expect me to be? Keela hesitated. Scared, she said finally. Angry. Running. Dan laughed again. Well, he said, you must not know many good folks. Kayla looked at him. Maybe not, she admitted. Dan patted the step beside him. Well, he said, you're getting to know one now. Kayla looked out at the fields. The sun was high now, bright and warm. The wind carried the smell of earth and growing things. For the first time, she felt something she couldn't name, something soft, something quiet, like peace, like trust. Dan stood up. You staying a while? He asked. Keela looked at him. Yes, she said. Dan nodded. Good, he said. We'll find something for you to do. He walked inside, leaving Keela alone on the porch. She looked up at the sky. Space was vast, full of danger, full of war. But here, on this quiet planet, a single human had changed everything. Because he didn't run. Because he was kind. Because he saw something in her that she had never seen before. Hope. Keela stayed on the porch for a long time after Dan went inside. The sun was warm on her skin. She could hear birds chirping and the soft hum of insects flying through the air. Everything here felt slow, quiet, not like home. Back on Zilari Prime, life moved fast. People talked in sharp voices. Every action had purpose. Kindness was rare. Trust was dangerous. But here, people smiled at each other. They said hello to strangers. They helped without being asked. Dan was not the only one. She had seen it already. Others came by his farm that day. Neighbors, friends, even kids on bikes who waved at her from the road. They didn't run. They didn't scream. They just looked at her and kept going, like she belonged. Keela stood up slowly. She walked back toward the ship. The door was still open. She stepped inside and tapped a small panel on the wall. A soft voice answered, "Commander Virex." "Status report?" Kayla took a breath. "This is Lieutenant Kayla Virex," she said. "I am requesting extended time on world." There was a pause. "Extended time?" the voice asked. "For what purpose?" Kayla looked out through the open door. Dan was back outside now, walking toward the barn with a bucket in his hand. "To observe," she said. Another pause. "Very well," the voice said. "You have 72 hours. Do not make contact with more than 5 individuals. Keep all data secure." The line went silent. Keela stepped out of the ship again and into the morning light. Dan saw her and raised a hand. "You coming or what?" he called. Keela walked toward him. "What are you doing?" she asked. Dan held up the bucket. "Feeding the chickens," he said. "You can help if you want." Keela looked at the bucket, then at Dan. "Why would I do that?" Dan shrugged. "Because it needs to be done, and you're here." He turned and started walking toward the coop. Keela followed. Inside the chicken pen, birds clucked and pecked at the ground. Dan opened the gate and tossed food across the dirt. The chickens ran toward it, squawking loudly. Keela watched them. "Strange creatures," she said. Dan laughed. "They're good for eggs and meat, not much else." Keela tilted her head. "Do they know that?" Dan blinked. "Know what?" "That you use them for food." Dan thought about it. "Nope, don't think so." Keela frowned. "Isn't that cruel?" Dan shook his head. "They live good lives. Get fed every day. Stay safe. When their time comes, it's quick." Kayla looked at the chickens again. Dan noticed her look. "You got animals like this where you come from?" he asked. Keela nodded. "Yes, but we do not keep them as pets. We do not feed them unless they serve a purpose." Dan gave her a long look. "Must be lonely," he said. Keela didn't answer. After feeding the chickens, Dan showed her how to collect eggs. He handed her a basket and told her to pick them up gently. She did, carefully placing them in the basket, one by one. "How do you know which ones are ready?" she asked. Dan pointed. "Look for the clean ones that aren't cracked." Keela looked closely at the eggs. "You take care with these," she said. Dan smiled. "Yeah, they're fragile. Gotta treat 'em right." Keela looked at him. "You treat everything with care," she said. Dan shrugged. "Sure, why wouldn't I?" Keela didn't answer. Later that afternoon, Dan drove her into town. It was small. Just a few stores, a gas station, and a diner with a neon sign that flickered even in daylight. Dan parked in front of the diner. "You hungry?" he asked. Keela nodded. They went inside. The smell of coffee and fried food filled the air. People sat in booths or at the counter. They looked up as Dan entered. "Mornin', Dan," one man said. "Hey there," said a woman behind the counter. Dan waved. "Hey, Linda." They sat down at the counter. Linda handed them menus without asking. "Same as usual?" she asked Dan. "Always," Dan said. Keela looked at the menu. She didn't understand most of the words. Dan noticed. "Get the pancakes," he said. "Best thing on the menu." Keela closed the menu and nodded. When the food came, she watched Dan eat before she tried hers. The pancakes were soft, sweet. Unlike anything she had ever tasted, she ate slowly. Around them, people talked, laughed, shared stories. A boy told his mother about school. 2 old men argued over sports. No one paid much attention to Keela, except one girl. She was young, maybe 10 years old, sat in a booth with her parents. She stared at Keela for a long time. Finally, she got up and walked over. "Are you an alien?" she asked. Keela looked at Dan. Dan smiled. "Yep." The girl's eyes widened. "Cool," she said. Keela blinked. "You are not afraid?" The girl shook her head. "No, aliens are awesome." She grinned. Dan chuckled. "Well, you heard it from the expert." The girl went back to her seat, still smiling. Keela watched her go. Then she looked at Dan. "They do not fear me," she said. Dan nodded. "Nope, don't see why they should." Keela looked around the diner again. People were kind. They shared. They laughed and they were curious, not scared, not angry, just interested. After breakfast, Dan took her to the local library. It was small but full of books. Dan found one about space and handed it to her. "For you," he said. Keela opened it. Pictures of stars, planets, and ships filled the pages. "Why?" she asked. Dan smiled. "You're from space, right? Might enjoy learning more about how we see it." Keela looked at the book. "You are trying to teach me," she said. Dan shrugged. "Sure. Seems fair. You're learning about us. We should learn about you too." Keela looked at him. "You are strange," she said. Dan laughed. "Maybe, but I think you like it." Keila didn't answer. They spent the rest of the day walking through town. Dan introduced her to people. They smiled, shook hands, asked questions. None of them ran. None of them threatened. They just wanted to know her. Keila began to feel something new. Something she couldn't name. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was warmth. Like she was part of something. Like she was welcome. As the sun set, Dan drove her back to the farm. They sat on the porch again. The sky turned red and purple. Crickets began to sing. Keila looked at Dan. "You are not like I expected," she said. Dan smiled. "You said that already?" Keila nodded. "I mean it." Dan sipped his coffee. "You know," he said, "most folks think aliens are going to come down here and blow things up, take over, rule the planet." He looked at her. "But you?" he said. "You're just trying to understand us." Keila looked down. "I thought humans were dangerous," she said. "Violent. Selfish." Dan nodded. "Some are. Can't deny that." He looked out at the fields. "But some of us," he said, "try to be better." Keila thought about the girl in the diner, the librarian who smiled, the waitress who brought her pancakes, the people who waved at her from the road. They weren't scared. They weren't hiding. They were just human. Keila looked up at the darkening sky. Space was vast, full of war, full of danger. But here, on this quiet planet, she had found something unexpected. Hope, trust, kindness. Dan leaned back. "You staying another night?" he asked. Keila looked at him. "Yes," she said. Dan smiled. "Good," he said. "We'll find something for you to do tomorrow." Keila sat beside him, watching the stars appear one by one, and for the first time she felt like she was home. The next morning, the sun rose slowly over the fields. Birds sang from the trees. A soft wind moved through the tall grass. Dan stepped out of the house, yawning and rubbing his eyes. He looked toward the field where Keela's ship still sat. She was already outside. Keila stood near the edge of the farm, watching the sunrise. She had been up for hours. Ever since dawn broke, she had been thinking about everything she had seen, about Dan, about the people in town, about how they treated her, not like an enemy, not like something to fear, but like someone who belonged. Dan walked over, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "Mornin'," he said, handing one mug to her. Keila took it without a word. They stood side by side, sipping their drinks in silence. After a while, Dan spoke. "You okay?" he asked. Keela looked at him. Yes, she said. Dan studied her face. You sure? He asked. You look like you're thinking hard. Keela nodded. I am. Dan raised an eyebrow. And what are you thinking about? Keela looked down, at the ground, about humans, she said. About how you act, how you treat others. Dan smiled slightly. What about it? Keela hesitated. You do not act like I expected, she said. You help strangers, you smile at people you do not know. You trust too easily. Dan chuckled. Maybe we do, he said. But that don't mean it's wrong. Keila frowned. It is not wrong, she said. But it is dangerous. Dan looked at her. Dangerous how? Keila turned to face him fully. Because you open yourselves to harm, she said. Because you believe the best in people, even when they do not deserve it. Dan thought for a moment. Yeah, he said. Sometimes people take advantage of that. Sometimes they hurt us because of it. He looked out over the fields. But most of the time, he said, people give back what you give them. Keila didn't answer. Dan looked at her. You don't trust easy, do you? He asked. Keila shook her head. On my world, she said, trust is earned. It is not given freely. Dan nodded. Makes sense, he said. In some places, you gotta be careful. Can't blame you for that, he paused. But here, he said, most folks just want to live their lives, help each other, make things better. Keila looked at him. You are different, she said. Dan smiled. Maybe, he said. Or maybe, I'm just like most good people. Later that day, Dan invited Keila to go into town again. This time, they went to the school. It was small, just one building with a few classrooms. Dan knew the principal, so they were allowed inside. Children ran through the halls. They laughed, chased each other, talked loudly. When they saw Keila, they stopped. Some stared, some whispered. Then one girl walked up. Are you really an alien? She asked. Keila nodded. The girl grinned. Cool. Other kids gathered around. They asked questions, wanted to touch her skin, wanted to know what space was like. Keila answered as best she could. One boy asked if she had superpowers. No, she said. I am just like you, only different. Dan watched the whole thing with a smile. After the school visit, they went to the local community center. There was a meeting happening, neighbors gathering to talk about the town's needs. Dan introduced Keila to everyone. They welcomed her, asked her questions, listened. No one feared her. No one treated her like an outsider. Dan leaned close to her. Here, see? He said. Not all bad, right? Keila looked around. These people were not soldiers, not warriors, not leaders. They were farmers, teachers, parents, ordinary people. Yet they treated her with kindness, with trust, like she was one of them. Keila felt something deep inside her shift. That night, Dan and Keila sat on the porch again. The stars shined, bright above them. Dan handed her another cup of coffee. You ever think about staying? He asked. Keila looked at him. Staying? She repeated. Dan nodded. Yeah, he said. You seem to like it here, and people seem to like you. Keila looked down at her coffee. I cannot stay, she said. Dan didn't look surprised. Why not? He asked. Keila sighed. My people will wonder where I am, she said. They will come looking. Dan nodded. So tell them the truth, he said. Tell them humans aren't monsters. Tell them we're not worth fearing. Keila looked at him. You think that will change anything? She asked. Dan shrugged. Might, he said. Or it might not. But you've seen something real here, something good. He looked at her. Don't waste it, he said. Keila didn't speak for a long time. Then she said, I have never met anyone like you. Dan smiled. Well, he said, now you have. A few days passed. Keila stayed with Dan, helped with chores, talked to people, watched how they lived, how they cared. how they gave. One evening, Dan showed her a video on his old laptop. It was a news clip. Footage of a protest in a big city. People marching, shouting, demanding change. Dan pointed at the screen. "That's human too," he said. "We don't always agree. We fight. We argue. We mess up." He looked at Keela. "But we try," he said. "Even when we fail, we try again." Keela watched the video. She thought about her own people. Xilari did not forgive failure. Xilari did not value kindness. Xilari did not believe in second chances. But humans? They did. They believed in more than strength. They believed in hope, in love, in change. Keela closed the laptop. "You are strange," she said again. Dan laughed. "Maybe," he said. "But I think you like it." Keela looked at him. "Yes," she said quietly. "I do." The next day, Dan helped Keela prepare for her return. Her ship needed repairs before she could leave. Dan found tools, scrap metal, old wires. They worked together in the barn. As they worked, Dan asked her, "What will you tell them?" Keela paused. "About humans," Dan said. "When you go back?" Keela looked at him. "The truth," she said. Dan smiled. "Good," he said. They finished the work late that night. Keela stood beside her ship. Dan stood with her. "Thank you," she said. Dan looked at her. "For what?" he asked. Keela looked at the sky. "For showing me something new," she said. Dan smiled. "You're welcome," he said. Keela stepped into the ship. Before closing the door, she looked at Dan one last time. "You are not like I expected," she said. Dan waved. "You're not either," he said. The door closed. Lights blinked. The ship lifted off. Dan watched it disappear into the stars. Then he turned and walked back toward the house. The wind blew gently. The stars shined above. And somewhere out there, in the dark of space, a auxiliary officer sat in her ship writing a report. Humans are not what we believed them to be. They are not weak. They are not cruel. They are not enemies. They are kind. They are strong. They are human. She looked out the window. Earth grew, smaller behind her, but its light remained, bright, warm, hopeful. Keela sat alone in her ship as it flew through space. The stars passed by slowly outside the window. The hum of the engines filled the quiet cabin. She had left Earth behind, but its memory stayed with her. She kept thinking about Dan, about the town, about the people who smiled at her like she was just another guest. Not a threat, not a monster, just someone new. Her commander would be waiting for her report. She had not told anyone what really happened down there. Now, as she neared the Xilari command station orbiting a cold, dead moon, she knew she could not hide the truth forever. The ship docked smoothly. A team waited for her inside the station. They wore sharp uniforms, their faces unreadable. Keela stepped out and stood tall. She had done this before, returned from missions, given reports, answered questions, but never like this. Never with something worth saying. Her commander, a tall woman named Vera Solon, approached. "Lieutenant Virex," she said. "Your delay was noted." Keela nodded. "I needed time," she said. "To observe." Vera studied her face. "And what did you see?" she asked. Keela took a breath. "Humans are not what we believe them to be." Silence followed. Then Vera frowned. "Explain." Keela led them into the command room. She opened her data pad and pulled up video logs, voice recordings, notes from her time on Earth. She showed them Dan's farm, the town, the school, the diner. People laughing, helping, caring, without fear, without hesitation. She played the voices of children asking questions, of adults welcoming her, of Dan telling her that kindness was not weakness. When she finished, no one spoke. Finally, Vera looked at her. "You are saying they are not dangerous?" Keela shook her head. "They are not weak," she said. "They are strong in ways we do not understand." Vera narrowed her eyes. "They have weapons," she said. "They fight among themselves. They destroy their own lands. Kayla nodded. Yes, she said. But they also rebuild. They care. They give second chances. She looked at each officer in the room. They do not run, she said. Even when they should. Even when they know danger is coming, they stay. They help. They fight not just for survival, but for each other. A long silence followed. Then Vera spoke. This changes nothing. Kayla looked at her. It should. Vera shook her head. We cannot trust them based on one encounter, she said. One human. Kayla stepped forward. Dan was not special, she said. He was not a leader, not a warrior. He was just a man, a farmer, a good man. She looked around the room. But he was not alone, she said. There were others, many others. Kind, brave, willing to help even when they had nothing to gain. She paused. If we go to war with them, she said, we will not face machines. We will not face monsters. She met Vera's gaze. We will face humans, she said. And they will not run. Another silence fell. Then Vera sighed. You have made your point, she said. But the council will decide. Kayla nodded. Then let me speak to them. Weeks passed. Kayla stood before the Zilari High Council. They sat in a curved room of dark metal and glowing screens. They listened as she spoke. She told them everything. About Dan. About the town. About the way humans helped each other without being asked. She showed them the footage. She read them the words of children, of teachers, of farmers. She told them how Dan offered her food, how he invited her into his home, how he treated her like a friend, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. When she was done, the council was silent. Then the head counselor, an old man named Ren, leaned forward. You believe they are different, he said. Kayla nodded. They are, she said, in ways we do not understand. Ren looked at the others. And if we make contact, he asked. What then? Kayla looked at him. Then we learn, she said. From them. From their way of life. She looked around the room. They do not always win, she said, but they keep trying. They believe in better things, in hope, in change. She paused. We can learn from them, she said, if we are willing to listen. After a long pause, Ren spoke. This is not a decision we make lightly, he said. But we will not move against them. Kayla exhaled. Thank you, she said. Ren looked at her. But we will watch, he said. Carefully. Kayla nodded. That was enough. For now. Months later, Kayla stood again on the observation deck of the auxiliary station. Earth was far below, a blue and green dot in the black sea of stars. She thought about Dan, about the porch, about the coffee, about the way he smiled like nothing in the world could scare him. She wondered if he still remembered her, if he ever looked up at the sky and thought about her too. Back on Earth, Dan stood in his field looking up at the night sky. The stars shined bright above him. He sipped his coffee, smiled, and whispered to himself, well, that was interesting. Somewhere far away. Kayla smiled too, because she had seen something rare, something powerful, something worth protecting. Humanity.